Welcome, everyone. We're glad you all have taken the time out of your evening schedule to be here as we discuss a really important issue for the state of Florida. I'm Dr. Bob McClure, President and CEO of the James Madison Institute. As many of you know, some of you may not, JMI is Florida's oldest and largest free market think tank. And while we're based in Tallahassee, we're statewide from Key West to Jacksonville, across to Pensacola, and all points in between. Through free market ideas, we seek to impact public policy on a whole host of different issues. Tonight, we really seek to focus on the issue of juvenile justice and its future in the state of Florida. The principles that guide JMI, many of you know, as I said, this is an issue, juvenile justice and its potential reforms, that focuses on the moral issue, the future of our young people, an economic issue, that is the future of the state budget and local budgets, and also an issue that relates to all Floridians. And that's what we're really focused on here. You're going to hear, I also want to introduce briefly the Project on Accountable Justice. Deb, where's Deb? Deb's over here. Many of you know Deb. Allison DeFore also is here. You're going to hear more from PAJ here in just a couple of minutes. We have a number of guests that I'd like to recognize publicly who are here this evening. We'd like to thank a number of Florida officials. First and foremost, the DJJ Secretary, Wansley Walters, is here. Where is Secretary? There's Madam Secretary. Thank you. We're glad you're here. And she has brought several of her staff members with her as well. We have Representative Neil Cumby, who's also with us tonight. Okay. Representative Katie Edwards, Representative Gail Harrell, Representative Mike Hill, Representative Dave Hood, Representative Charles McBurney is also here. Thank you. Glad you're here. Representative Carrie Pigman. I saw thank you, Representative Pigman. Glad you're here. Representative Hill, saw you up there. Thank you. Representative Ray Pilon is here. Thank you. Glad you're here. Representative Bobby Powell. Can't see. All right. Representative Sharon Pritchett. And if I've missed anyone else, please let me know. Is there anyone else who's here tonight? Elected officials. Thank you. I know we're eager to get started on the debate, so I'll be very brief. We're here to have an open discussion about the role of government, the proper role of government in the juvenile justice system. And there are a couple of different schools of thought, as you can tell from our guests who are here tonight. As we approach working with young people who come into contact with the many different entities of the justice system, I think you'll leave the evening learning a great deal. We're fortunate to have tonight three distinguished guests to lead us in the issue and to explore it in further detail. Hopefully you've been given a copy of their bios when you signed in, but I want to present just a few brief highlights. First, we're honored to have our moderator tonight, Chief Anthony Holloway, who's joined us and who is here with us from the Clearwater Florida Police Department. Please welcome Chief Holloway. Chief Holloway joined the Clearwater Police Department in 1985. During his career with the Clearwater Police Department, Chief Holloway served as patrol officer, a community policing specialist, an undercover vice and narcotics detective, a patrol sergeant, a detective sergeant, and the list goes on and on and on until he became Chief of Police in 2010. During Chief Holloway's tenure with the Clearwater Police Department, he received numerous awards, including the Kiwanis Club Joseph F. Cornelius Family Foundation Outstanding Police Officer of the Year Award, the highest honor given by the Clearwater Police Department, Fraternal Order of the Police Officer of the Year as well. And then finally, the Clearwater Police Department is the third largest law enforcement agency in Pinellas County. The department has been in the forefront of addressing social problems and has been named one of the nation's safest cities. We also have with us State Attorney Angela Corey from Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit. Please welcome
Good evening.
Angela Corey. Ms. Corey is a native of Jacksonville and a second-generation Floridian. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in marketing from Florida State University and her JD from the University of Florida. We welcome you anyway.
Thank you.
Angela is a 32-year veteran prosecutor and began her career in 1981 under State Attorney Ed Austin. During her initial 25-year tenure in the 4th Judicial Circuit, Corey tried hundreds and hundreds of cases. And in August of 2008, she was elected to serve as the State Attorney of the 4th Judicial Court of Florida. In addition to her career trial work efforts, she's devoted an equal amount of time to training police and prosecutors on local, state, and national levels. Since 1982, Angela has taught classes for the Police Academy at Florida State College in Jacksonville. She served as training director for the State Attorney's Office, as well as lectured extensively on a variety of topics for the Florida Prosecuting Attorneys Association. Please join me in welcoming Angela Corey again for being here.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Mr. Vikrant Reddy from the Texas Public Policy Foundation Center for Effective Justice and Right on Crime. Welcome. Mr. Reddy is a policy analyst at the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where he coordinates the Right on Crime campaign. He has authored several reports on criminal justice policy and is a frequent speaker and media commentator on this topic. Vikrant has worked as a research assistant at the Cato Institute, as a law clerk for the Honorable Gina Benavides of the 13th Court of Appeals of Texas, and as an attorney in private practice, focusing on trial and appellate litigation. He also earned his law degree at Southern Methodist University at the Dedman School of Law in Dallas. He is also a member of the State Bar of Texas and of the State Bar's Appellate Section and Criminal Justice Section as well. And I think it's also important to understand that one of the reasons we asked him to be here is that the state of Texas and the state of Florida share numerous demographics. They share numerous opportunities in the future. You look at our demographics, you look at where the states of Florida and Texas are, and there are a lot of similarities. And so we've asked him to join us. We think he'll provide that perspective. And with that, I'd like to invite Chief Holloway now to come forward and begin the debate.
Good evening, Dr. McClure. Thank you very much for having us here tonight. First of all, as we start this debate, there are a few ground rules to let you know. First of all, the reason why they invited me here tonight because I have a taser, so if you go past your time, I will tase you.
Distance between.
First, what we're going to do is have you do an opening statement, and I'll give you the question. The first one would be, what is the role of government in the juvenile justice system is? Ms. Corey?
Well, anytime the word justice is used, the government is involved. I believe that it's the first order of government to protect our community on a national, state, and local level. As the state attorney and one of 20 in the state of Florida, it is our job to work with law enforcement side by side to protect the citizens of our communities. So it is interwoven. You can't separate government from justice, whether it's adult justice or juvenile justice. I swore to uphold and protect our Constitution when I was an assistant state attorney back in 1981 under Ed Austin, with whom Representative McBurney and I worked, and he trained us that we were there to do the right thing for the right reason. And he put me in juvenile court. My very first day calling cases from a podium as a prosecutor was in juvenile court. And I loved that experience. It was an experience that has served me well throughout my career. But it is our job as prosecutors to analyze every single case on a case-by-case basis and do the right thing pursuant to the Constitution and to the state statutes. I can tell you that we see a lot of violence in our community, and the sad thing is we're seeing a lot of that come from people under the age of 18, and even more critical to the issue we're here about tonight, under the age of 16. And we're seeing more young women. So there are some alarming things that we're seeing, but there's also a lot of good news, and we need to focus on that as well. I have to tell you that some of these kids, and we call them child legally, we have to call them a child when they're in the juvenile system, are bigger than any person in this room, and some of them are meaner than anybody you've ever come across. And it is alarming. I've stood in juvenile court and watched a young man who told his pregnant mother he was going to kick the baby out of her stomach if she didn't do what he wanted her to do. Now, I could stand here all night and give you specifics, but I won't. I want to focus on the intent of our law and the philosophy of our law. When I started in the juvenile justice system, it was a parens patriae mentality that we have to step in and be a parent to these kids. But kids have changed. Even back then, there were some kids who had nothing behind their eyes. There was no remorse. They weren't afraid to be in a courtroom. And now we have kids who don't respect their families, they don't respect judges, they don't respect law enforcement officers, and sadly, they don't respect themselves. What do you do with kids like that? Well, first you have to analyze, is it a kid that's like that? And if they are appropriate for diversion, then you divert them. We diverted last year, I believe, 41% of our juvenile arrests, and it's a good thing to do. But and my chief assistant, my first chief assistant, Dan McCarthy, is here. Dan, thank you for being here. Dan came to us from a background of military justice. And I think one of the things that shocked him and shocks other people is when you start to analyze a case, you scratch your head and say, what do you do with a kid that by the age of 14 has already committed 2 gun crimes, has already hurt another human being, or unfortunately has already raped or killed another human being? So you can't broad brush any specific age. You can't broad brush any specific crime. You have to look at our laws and say what's going to be the best to protect the community, try to restore our victim, and also do what's best for the perpetrator. And I think that we have to look at all of those things as prosecutors when we make that decision.
Okay, Ms. Reddy, I'm going to call time on that one.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for allowing me to give that opening.
Mr. Reddy?
Sure. Well, I want to start just by thanking the Project on Accountable Justice and the James Madison Institute for inviting me here. And I also want to thank Ms. Corey for consenting to the debate today. Ms. Corey has a very difficult job, and I mean that. Prosecutors are often maligned in the media. It is not easy. 90% of lawyers don't have to go through what prosecutors go through. And I think that they are knee-deep in these issues, and the perspective the prosecutors bring is worth listening to. But it's also true that defense attorneys are knee-deep in the process, service providers are knee-deep in the process, that judges are knee-deep in the process, and if you get all these people in the room together, they all come out with 10 different opinions. So that's not really the end of the story. There's a lot of different perspectives to be offered here. And on the fundamental question that you've asked, what is the role of government in juvenile justice, I guess, lawyers are all taught that there are basically 4 principal roles, and those are incapacitation of the offender, the deterrence of future offenders, the rehabilitation of the offender, and retribution, in a sense, the restoration of the victim. And really, the only thing that incarceration and locking up offenders does well is incapacitation. That's important, and there are offenders that need to be incapacitated. But on all of the other 3 metrics, heavy-handed incarceration and lockups have proven to be counterproductive. And so I think it is really important to take a look at what else the government can do. I want to note, by the way, that I'm here from a conservative organization, Right on Crime. And for those of you who roll your eyes when conservatives talk about Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman and things like that, you will hear some of that tonight because we are a conservative group. But that's an important point because a lot of the arguments that I'm making have traditionally been made by people on the left. And I just think that's a little silly. Conservatives view these issues the exact same way. Our statement of principles has been signed by Jeb Bush, the governor of this great state, Newt Gingrich, Ed Meese, a lot of other very prominent conservatives. They understand that we have to hold the government accountable and make sure the government is transparent on all levels. That's not just healthcare, that's not just education, that's corrections also. And we need to take a look at how we can do these things better and more efficiently.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
Well, I think that when you look at the costs of incarceration, you can't count that alone. How much more does it cost you to have a repeat offender who serves a short amount of time, violates his probation, commits a new crime, and you start the cycle all over again? So I think when it comes to what we call, or what a lot of people refer to as smart justice, you have to look at the total cost. I think there are a lot of ways to handle these things and a lot of ways that you can look to reduce the cost of government, but the government's always going to be involved in the justice system. It's our job to protect the community, and I don't think that you can limit the budgets of law enforcement or prosecutors just to try to say that incarceration's not working, because what is the alternative? And then who pays the costs of those alternatives? The taxpayers. So you can't just look at the cost of incarceration, you have to look at all of the costs. And of course, it's like that commercial. It's priceless to have a community that feels safe. So if that involves locking people up for long periods of time because they won't obey the law, not because they can't, but because they won't, then we have to lock them up, and sometimes we have to lock them up for long periods.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
Well, I agree that we also have to look at costs in terms of victimization, not just in terms of dollars. That's obviously very important. But what's interesting is that when you look at what happens in terms of victimization and in terms of repeat behavior, whenever you use the incarceration solution more than you use the detention and alternative solutions, you find really, really appalling recidivism rates. I mean, these methods of dealing with these kinds of offenders have proven not to work. Newt Gingrich, who I mentioned before, has a really great line on this. He says, you know, if 2/3 of all the bridges that the government built collapsed, we would say that the government's bridge building program is not working. Well, nationally, we have a 2/3 recidivism rate, so the prisons are not working. I think it's worth asking here in Florida whether or not we want to deal with locking up somebody who's 14 years old, who we will then be paying for in terms of dollars, and as you pointed out, in terms of victimization, for 10, 20, 30 years. It is a very long time. This individual at the age of 14, they're not going to be there till they're 90. They will come out someday. They will live next door to you and me, and we want to make sure that they are on the path to not reoffend.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to, get into some of the questions. But first, I'd like to start off this way. Everyone stand up if you committed some type of crime under the age of 18. You didn't get caught for it, but you committed some type of crime. Okay. So this is the audience that you're looking at. And if you go around this room here, we all have great jobs.
Is the statute of limitations run on those yet? Okay.
Well, the reason why I was doing it, we're videotaping this. I'm going to figure out which county they're from and go from there. So that gets us right into our first question here. Do you believe that children, defined as youth under the age of 18, are different than adults? Do you feel that they should be treated differently under the law? And where do you draw the line when children should be treated as adults?
Well, again, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. The definition of child varies in our statutes. It's a different definition for sexual battery than it is for whether or not they're a juvenile. Some states send all juveniles 16 years or older that commit a felony, they send them to adult court automatically. And again, it just depends on how you define it. Like I said, some of these children are 6'2" or bigger, 200 pounds or more, and mean as it comes. And they are vicious, and you can lock them up, and if you let them out, they are going to offend again because they choose to live a criminal lifestyle. So I think what you have to do is appreciate the laws that our legislators have given us, where in Florida we have the ability to put a juvenile into adult court and still give them juvenile sanctions if it's appropriate. It's a good law. It's worked for all these years, and there's no reason to change it. A judge in the right circumstances can still give juvenile sanctions even when that juvenile has been put in adult court.
Mr. Reddy?
Well, there are juveniles who are 6'2" and 300 pounds, but that doesn't make them adults. What makes you an adult is your brain. And I know that it's become really controversial to go into talking about brain science, but I'm not sure why. It's very clear. All the scientific evidence we have is that the child brain is different from the adult brain. And I don't just mean that it's underdeveloped and that you're a somebody put it this way, an adult with less mileage on the brain. That's not true. The child brain makes you a completely different person than the adult brain does. It's a lack of poor impulse control. It's a way of responding really well to the reward incentives, but not responding very well to the fact that there are certain negative incentives that you're going to get in trouble if you do something. I mean, people know this when it comes to non-criminal sorts of things, the kinds of silly shenanigans everybody gets into as a teenager. So it is true that there are some very big and very scary looking kids, but they're still kids. And so I do think that we have to be careful about looking at external appearance and saying that this person has to be treated as an adult rather than as a child.
Bottle?
Oh, yes. Let me talk about some of the shorter, lighter ones then, because it doesn't take a whole lot of development to learn how to load a semi-automatic weapon, shove it in somebody's face, and take their property from them. So that's not a childlike crime. That has nothing to do with impulse control. That has everything to do with plotting and planning. Loading a semi-automatic isn't an easy thing to do for those of you who have never done it before or don't do it on a regular basis. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of preparation, and they're willing to commit these big adult types crimes. And they are willing to pull that trigger and put a bullet through another human being. It has nothing to do with impulse control. And a lot of the juveniles are committing the very same crimes that people's in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. When we had the very controversial case of a 12-year-old that killed his baby brother, he killed that baby much in the same manner as the 25-year-old we just arrested this past week in Jacksonville, who also smashed a baby's head and sent it to the hospital where the baby then died. So how is it a different crime? What does it have to do with impulse control? What it has to do with is a lot of times either a conscious decision to commit a crime or the inability to control themselves, where we do have to lock people up, whether they're adults or juveniles, if they just can't live within the norms and the laws of society.
Mr. Reddy?
It is difficult to load a semi-automatic, but I come from Texas, and a lot of us learned how to do it before we turned 10, and everybody acknowledges that those are still kids. And I think that I would go back to my original point, which is that those are not the characteristics that define whether or not somebody is an adult.
Okay, I'm going to add on to this because I think both of you are not answering the question that we want to know here. Where do you draw the line? Is it a felony? Is it a misdemeanor? Where is that line drawn in the sand?
Well, you draw it at the level of the offense where it is a violent felony or the person's a repeat offender and juvenile can do nothing else for them. But I would say this, the fact that you put them in the adult system isn't saying, poof, you're an adult. What it's saying is the remedies in adult court are a lot better to deal with this specific individual. And like I said, when you can still combine adult and juvenile sanctions, then it gives our judges and our prosecutors a lot of flexibility to handle someone who is not appropriately handled in the juvenile justice system. And that's been the determining factor for most of our direct files.
Well, I think that you have to look at the age, and I also do agree that you have to look at things like repeat offenses and you have to look at the violent nature of the crime. But so that we don't agree too much, let me respond to one point, which is that it is true that you can go to adult court, and still get a juvenile sanction. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I mean, you can go to adult court and get a juvenile sanction, but where is that individual being kept before they go to trial? Are they being exposed to other adult offenders? When they emerge after the sanction has been given, do they continue to have a record that's going to hamper them for the rest of their lives when it comes to applying to college for scholarships, entering the military, getting an occupational license, or any number of things? I think we want to worry about those issues too, because again, as we said earlier, for juveniles, you could derail their life for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and that's something that we're all going to be paying for, again, in terms of both dollars and victimization.
Rebuttal? Basically, what you're saying is it's okay to do that for an 18-year-old, but not for a 17-year-old. That's why it's got to be handled, because you have a lot of co-defendants, some of whom are over the age of 18 barely, and some of whom are under the age of 18. So you have to evaluate them not based just on age, but on the quality and the nature of their crime and their background. And I can assure you, in the state of Florida, juvenile direct files can never be housed with adults prior to being sentenced or after they're sentenced. There are special facilities to hold them. They are never, ever housed with adults. They are housed with other juveniles who are direct filed.
Would you like to respond?
I'll stand by my answer.
Okay. Staying on the same topic, let's move on to another one here. Given the research shown that the kids that are arrested in high school nearly double the odds of not finishing high school or getting a job, how is it important not to arrest these kids with low crime like misdemeanors?
Well, we don't arrest kids. We never have. In the 32 years I've been there, we have always used at-large diversion, non-custodial arrest. It's a great concept. It's been in effect the whole time I've been a prosecutor. We had diversion programs when I started 32 years ago. We're still diverting kids. The police don't have to make an arrest. They don't have to do it on an adult. If an adult gets pulled over and has a small joint in their car and they don't have any prior record, the police give them what's called a notice to appear. It is a non-custodial arrest. It does not give them that arrest record. They go through court. We usually divert them right off the bat. They pay a fine, get counseling if they need it, and that's the end of that story. But let me just say this. With a lot of the high-profile cases, why are we worried about sealing a juvenile's records? You can't erase the internet. And a lot of these cases, they're publicized from the minute that they happened. So we're going to seal a record when all an employer has to do is Google that person's name and find out that 20 years ago they committed a crime when they were a juvenile. It's we can work on some issues to try to help people not get a permanent record. But right now, with the amount of publicity that's being given to every single crime being committed, you're not going to be able to erase that internet.
Mr. Reddy.
I know that people hate the phrase school-to-prison pipeline. They think it's cliche, but I think there's something to that. And I do think we have to worry about putting our students into the world of the judicial system when, again, they're 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. I think that's really dangerous. And I think it has been a problem in the past. I should say that Florida, although we're talking about future reforms here, Florida in the last few years really has done some terrific things. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I was going over some of the legislation that has passed, some of the court decisions that have come down, and I think a bill was passed recently that that prohibits sending misdemeanors into the judicial system in schools. You can't be doing that kind of thing. You can't be writing those criminal tickets. But then my question is, if that legislation was passed, it suggests that there was some problem beforehand. So I think that it has been an issue here in the past, and it's great that Florida's moved forward, and I think there's much work left to be done, but I think it has been a problem.
Go ahead.
Okay. I don't think by calling something civil, you erase the fact that the crime occurred. So I think it's the mechanism by which you get the juvenile into some sort of a diversion program. And we didn't need civil citations to do that. However, the statute's on the books, and we have encouraged our law enforcement officers to give them uniformly. In other words, don't just use them in the schools, use them in the malls, use them out in the public, use them appropriately for nonviolent misdemeanors. But the one thing that I've been fighting in Jacksonville is I'm not going to ask our officers to give those on a battery. A battery is not a nonviolent crime. It's not a fight. A fight implies violence between two people who mutually engage. A battery is when one person hits the other person. I mean, physical contact. And in that case, that situation should be reviewed by a prosecutor before we then can divert the case. And I don't think that's too much to ask for a victim who also has constitutional rights. So we can't lose sight of a victim's constitutional rights in trying to put all these juveniles in one pot. You just can't do it. You just cannot give all of them that first. And then how many chances have they gotten before the police have even been called? How many times has the teacher had to discipline them? How many times have they had an in-school suspension or an out-of-school suspension before the criminal justice system has even been implemented by the police being called and charges being levied? So how many chances are we going to give these children? I don't believe that school-to-prison pipeline, because we were accountable to our parents. We were more afraid of our parents and disappointing them than we were of the police. The kids we're dealing with today, by and large, aren't afraid of anybody and don't respect anybody.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, one thing I would agree with is that we probably rely too much on the government and not enough on families and communities and churches and local institutions to go back to handling these problems. But the question, of course, is what is the role of government? And government does have a role. And I think that I think I would say that this point about the difference between two kids who are fighting and a simple battery, that's an important and provocative point. And I agree that there's a distinction between those two kinds of acts, but it doesn't change what's inherent in the data, and that is that kid who bopped the other kid on the head, once you send him into this system, all of the evidence shows that his outcomes are going to be dramatically poorer than they would be for other students. And we have to look at ways that we can avoid that, because again, that's going to be a huge problem for all of us down the line.
Again, I'll stay on the same topic because we in law enforcement, also state attorney's office, get a lot of issues about people's safety. So they complain about that a lot. How come you're not, I'll use me, Tony Holloway. How come you're not putting Tony Holloway in jail for those burglaries? But then should we, government, have some type of strategy to help Tony Holloway? He commits one crime, a property crime, burglary. Now he has that felony. Now he has to carry that for the rest of his life. He can't get that job. He can't get into the military. What should we do with that child?
Well, again, we are diverting those children. When Dan and I were in transition, we interviewed a young man named Alan Louder. We actually joked that we started our administration off by stealing, and we stole Alan Louder from communities and schools because he was firmly entrenched in the jail school program where kids still try to get an education even when they're in on serious felonies. He is running our diversion programs, and what he is finding is that if you don't bring the parents into the fix, and the fix should be diversion, I do agree with you all on that, but it has to be for the non-violent offenders. It has to be. It can only be for the people who steal. Even some criminal mischiefs, and criminal mischief is a pretty deliberate crime. You know when you're destroying somebody else's property. That's not impulse control. That's doing something you know you're not supposed to do. So it depends on what the crime is, but if those kids are diverted, then they don't get that record, Chief. And so we are working, and we also work with outside agencies, non-governmental agencies who step in and help the kids with the counseling, who are helping the parents. But we're bringing the parents in to the diversion program and saying, you need to get fixed with your kid, or you need to know what's going on with your child so that we can solve this whole problem. And then we're trying to refer them out if there's more family issues, a recent divorce, those sorts of things. It's a huge diversion program. We just got honored or mentioned in a documentary called Beyond Scared Straight. In other words, we're not just trying to scare them straight by shaking them up and taking them to the jail and talking to inmates. We're actually working beyond that to try to fix them and their families and get them back. But that is not the function of the state attorney's office. We run that diversion program because it's the expedient thing to do, and it works best in the long run, and it saves money.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, Chief, you asked about these people who come out with records and how it limits them later in life. And Ms. Corey made the important point that, look, you're not going to stop the internet. That's always going to be out there. And that's an important point. Now, that said, you'll never get around that problem, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still look at fixes within our law. You know, there are actually plenty of people out there, I know some of them in Texas, who will look for ex-offenders who want to give them another chance because they've been ex-offenders themselves. There are certain companies who say, look, I have moral reasons, personal reasons for wanting to hire people like this. I want to give them a second chance. So, you know, that's not always the end of the world. It is the end of the world whenever the law constricts what you can do, whenever it is illegal to give somebody a second chance because they can't get a certain type of license, they cannot enter the military, they can't be approved for some scholarship or grant. And so that's a real legal solution. And Ms. Corey's right that there's a cultural and technological issue here that we'll never get around. I'm less concerned about that, though. I think that there is a way to fix the legal problem and that we should focus on doing that.
Okay. What do you believe is our best strategy to reduce the number of juvenile offenders? Ms. Corey?
Have parents hold their children more accountable, have more structure in the home, give these children something to do so that they don't want to go commit crimes. We were so busy when we were growing up. There was something every day, and a lot of it was centered around church. That might not be a popular topic for some of you, but whether it's centered around your church life, your family life, or your school life, there was no time to get in trouble because we were so engaged in what we were doing. So I'd love to see us go back to the vocational and technical medical schools. I don't know why we got so far away. Some kids don't want to study Shakespeare. Give them something to do with their hands. Develop their talent at an early age so that they then strive to be a furniture maker, a cabinet maker, or any other absolutely worthwhile career that they can strive towards. I'd love to see that as part of the solution.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, I actually agree with every word of that. That's certainly true. You know, I read a really interesting theory by a brilliant scholar in California who said, why does the school day end at 3 o'clock? Why doesn't it end at 5? Maybe even 6? And we just give kids all of this time to commit mischief. And there's another really interesting theory that a lot of you are aware that the juvenile crime rates actually have dropped across the country in the last decade or two. And some people think that has happened because kids play more video games and spend more time on the internet and have more TV options. That's not probably the most constructive way to spend that time. But there's real truth in what you're saying about how you've got to find ways to occupy this time, or else you're going to unleash all of these awful adolescent impulses. But look, I think inherent in this point that we both agree on, we also are agreeing on the fact that this is what kids do. And we're saying on another level, kids are different. Kids are not like adults. And so I think we've acknowledged an important point there that was discussed earlier in the debate tonight.
Thank you. Ms. Corey, you have been associated with being more tough on crime. What does that mean to you?
It means I'm living up to my word. I promised our community that I would be tough on repeat and violent offenders, and I have been. And that's been without sacrificing the desire to divert good people. And that has included gun crimes on adults. We had a 65-year-old man who got in a road rage incident with a much younger, much larger man. And for whatever reason, after words were exchanged, he ran back to his car and got his gun and held it on the young man. It's an ag assault. Can't do that. That's against the law. We ended up not only waiving the minimum mandatory on him, but when the time came to adjudicate him and let him do the time he had served, we decided to withhold adjudication because I felt like at 65 years old, he didn't deserve to have a record. And that meant more to him than anything, being able to say, I'm not going to be a convicted felon. That's why you have to look at every case on a case-by-case basis. You have to do it whether they're 65 or 14. And in order to try to rectify what they've done, the best you can do is fashion a sentence under and we've got great laws. They're as tough as we need them to be when it comes to minimum mandatories, and they're as discretionary as we need them to be to give the person who knows most about the crime, which is the prosecutor working with law enforcement, to make that decision, is this person worthy of a chance? And so we have to keep looking at every single case, but you can't, again, wholesale it and say, we're going to let all people who commit petty thefts get not just one bite at the apple, but 2 bites. You know, there was a push to give a second civil citation. And then what do? Then the first time they get arrested, then you give them a withhold, and then you put them on probation the 4th time, and then the 5th or 6th time. You cannot do it that way. You've got to handle each case on its own merits.
Mr. Redding, how do you feel about tough on crime?
Well, I'm not willing to cede the label tough on crime to the prosecutors. I think that the right on crime policies are extremely tough on crime. You know, the way I think about it is when you take an offender and you say to them, here, sit in this cell, that's not particularly tough. When you say to the offender, here's the deal, you have a drug problem, you're going to go to rehabilitation and you're going to kick that habit, and we will check you to make sure that you do. You owe restitution to a victim, you're going to pay it, and we are going to make sure that you do. You're going to put your life back together, you're going to learn a skill, you're going to learn a trade, you're going to get out there and be productive. To me, that's being tough. That would be far tougher. And so I think that, the folks who have signed on to our statement of principles, Grover Norquist and Ed Meese and Newt Gingrich, they're as tough as it gets. And I think the tough on crime label really belongs to the right on crime and smart on crime strategies.
Ms. Corey.
Well, it's great right until they throw that opportunity right back in your face and immediately violate their probation. We have a case that involved a young man who got chance after chance after chance in the juvenile system. And while he was in DJJ custody, he repaid their kindness of wanting to rehabilitate them by promptly going out and committing 2 carjackings. Violent, gun, conscious. He knew he had to stay home. He was on that type of a detention program, and he threw that in their face. And this was his third chance. I mean, he had already been in the juvenile system 3 times. So at some point, you have to draw that line in the sand and say, not with everybody who commits this crime, but with this specific person, he's going to adult court and he's going to prison, and I'm not going to apologize for it.
Mr. Reddy.
Oh, well, I can't speak to that particular case, but let me say something more broadly and tell a story from the Texas adult system, actually, that will maybe express this point. I think that sometimes the problem we run into is that the probation and parole services in states are not adequately funded, because instead we're sinking so much of our money into incarceration. In Texas, we had a situation in 2007 where the legislature was told that there is a budget surplus, there's all this money out there, and because so many people are moving to Texas, we're going to need to build a lot more new prison beds. I think the number was 17,000. It was going to cost $2 billion. We would need them by the year 2012. Well, you know, in Texas, they don't like to spend all the extra money. They don't like to go back and ask constituents for more tax dollars. So instead they said, well, look, what can we do to prevent this kind of growth? And they started talking to people in probation and parole, and they said, you know, these people on probation and parole are not really adequately monitored. We don't have the resources for that. But probation costs $250 a day in Texas, but incarceration costs something closer to $50 a day. If you took some of this money and put it into improving probation, parole, drug courts, electronic monitoring, things like this, you'd find that you get much better results down the line. All the years went by, 2012 rolled around, and instead of needing the extra 17,000 prison beds, I'm really happy to say that Texas shut down for the first time in modern history a prison. And then 2 years later, shut down 2 more. Sorry, 2011 we shut down a prison, 2013 we shut down 2 more. It's really a terrific success story, and it goes back to something the Chief said at the very beginning of this debate, which is that it's something that Florida can look towards as a guide, because Florida and Texas are so similar. They're similar demographically, they're similar you know, in the types of offenders and just the sorts of problems that both states are dealing with. And so I'm not saying just be like Texas, you know, make it your own model here in Florida, but these things really work, and it's not a theory, we have real evidence.
Perception versus reality. A lot of people feel that because of your socioeconomics or where you live, you're treated differently. Tough on crime, not tough on crime? How's that play into it?
We're tough on crime. We don't care whether you're male or female, black or white, Hispanic or whatever. We handle the case based on the facts of the case and the history of the offender. I don't believe that police officers, when they go out to a mall and 2 kids have stolen and they're similarly situated with no record or anything else, look at one kid and say, okay, you're a male, so I'm going to arrest you, but you're a female, so I'm going to give you a civil citation. That's just not how law enforcement operates, and it's not how your prosecutors operate. And that misimpression needs to stop. It's disingenuous, it's not based on real facts, and it's misleading a lot of good people. And so what you need to know is that there are so many safeguards in the law that even when a prosecutor does file the charges, judges can look at motions to dismiss. There are so many remedies available to defendants, and we have, and you may be aware of this, an excellent public defender system where these kids get immediate representation. They get representation within 24 hours of committing the crime and before they have to appear in front of a judge. So their rights are being protected from that minute forward. So I just don't see that there is this imbalance that people continue to claim. The people who are getting arrested are the people who are committing crimes. And it's that simple. And if there's not probable cause to arrest them, there's judges who aren't going to find it at that first appearance hearing.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, I'm afraid I feel like those discussions, and maybe Ms. Corey would agree with me, can be a real distraction, because I've seen some of these numbers about discrepancies, but at the end of the day, the solutions are all the same. Nobody is saying, well, the solution for the African-American child is different than the solution for the white child. Nobody is saying that, you know, the solution for the Hispanic child is different than the one for the Asian child. I mean, it's all going to be the same solutions. And so I think we're very focused on looking at solutions to these kinds of juvenile delinquency problems rather than focusing on these questions of racial and gender imbalance.
Okay. Excuse me. Do you think we need to change the ways we deal with juvenile offenders here in Florida for the first-time offenders, low-risk offenders?
No, I think we've been dealing with them appropriately for all these years. We have been diverting them, and by diversion, I mean they don't ever have to go in front of a judge. We put them in a program without them ever having to see a judge. And then if they do happen to have to go in front of a judge because of the time limitations, I sat in court today and watched Judge Henry Davis tell one child after another, the state attorney's handing you a youthful offender program contract. Your parents and you have signed that. Go forth and do good. I don't want to see you back here. So even when they do have to appear in front of the judge, he is ratifying. He is saying this is a good program. Go do something. I saw a young man today who had a ponytail, and it was really quite unattractive. He didn't want to go into the diversion program, or actually it was a DJJ program, because he didn't want to cut his hair. He was almost going to push it to the point that he would rather face felony charges than go into a program because he didn't want to cut his hair. There was a 5-minute discussion with Judge Davis and this young man about his hair. And it was stunning that that was his priority when he was being handed a chance. And luckily, his public defender leaned over and talked to him, and he chose the program. So, it's funny what we're seeing, and it's scary what we're seeing, but it's not going to stop us from continuing to work on the issues. And the Secretary and I, Secretary Wansley, thank you so much. She's come to Jacksonville on numerous occasions to meet with us and see our side of things, and for us to see her side of things. And we're going to keep working on our laws in Florida. I know we are.
Mr. Reddy.
I think that story about the kid with the ponytail is ridiculous, but it sounds like the kinds of things that kids do. And it kind of goes back to my original point that there's a real difference between kids and adults. That is really silly, Ms. Corey. I certainly acknowledge that. But yeah, that's what kids do. And I do think that there are things we can do differently with the way we treat juveniles here. I think that we should look at the way we handle disciplinary problems in schools. I think that we should look at graduated sanctions for offenses, and I do think that we should continue to look at more opportunities for detention.
Your rebuttal?
Well, I would just say if you look at any face sheet on a kid who has finally ended up in the adult system, what you're going to see is the first offense closed without sanctions, meaning that it was just handled. And the second offense was a diversion program. And the third offense was a withhold and probation. And you will see this escalating pattern of crime with a lot of these young people. And then we have some of them that just come right out of the box, put a gun in somebody's face, and take their property, and if they don't get the property, they'll shoot them dead right there. So you have to sort these kids out and make sure the ones you are putting in adult court deserve to be there. I stand behind every juvenile direct file decision we've made, and I thank our legislature for giving us the flexibility to still consider mitigation even after we've put them in the adult court. It's an excellent law, and we don't need to change our ability to direct file on juveniles.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, I'm going to stand by my former answer about the opportunities that are available, with the addendum that I think I said detention when I meant diversion. I was thinking back to what happened to me when I was a school kid that would get in trouble. But otherwise, I will stand by the previous answer.
We'll move on to something else then, as you were saying, Ms. Corey, about how we got all these great laws in place, but we still have repeat offenders. How do we stop those repeat offenders? And I'll add on more law enforcement, because some of the restrictions that we put on these kids, probation, we know some of these kids are going to fail these probation. We give them something that Johnny's got to stay home and be home by 8 o'clock. We know Johnny's not going to be home at 8 o'clock, so keep going over the cycle over and over again. What do we put in place to help that child succeed in probation?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of times the ankle monitors, the monitoring devices can help. We had one sad case where a couple of 15-year-olds and a 16-year-old decided that a great way to get money was to call a pizza delivery person and have them bring the pizza to a remote location and then rob the pizza person. Well, on the second night that they did this, after getting just a few dollars, the one young man who brought the gun looked at his watch and said, "Oh my gosh, my dad's going to kill me. I've got a curfew." And he went home, but left the gun with a 15-year-old who then used it to kill a sweet woman who was just working a second job. She was a military retiree who was working as a pizza delivery woman. And we agonized, Dan. Remember, we agonized over this kid who pulled the trigger. He was young, he was stupid, he was foolish, he still had to be punished. And we went into court and recommended 50 years, and over our recommendation, our judge gave him life because that's what the judge thought was appropriate. But the irony of that, the irony of a young man being afraid of his father's curfew, but not afraid to pass a loaded gun off, and be involved in the crime. And you know, that young man still got punished as a principal. So I've never been able to reconcile that, oh, I've got to obey curfew, but let's go ahead and get this robbery done. I don't know what you do with kids who have those kinds of thought processes, because they're not going to toe the line on the rules of probation if they're taking guns out of a home with a father strict enough to give them an 8 o'clock curfew. I don't know what you do with them.
Mr. Reddy.
No, I think it is incredibly bizarre. I can't get my head around a kid who, would be on the brink of committing this horrible crime and then would also look at his watch and say, "Oh, I've got to get home." It doesn't make any sense to me. But it goes back to my original point, which is that kids don't make sense. They have totally different brains, and we really have to look at them in a very unique way. They're different from adults. I think so many of these narratives that you've given us tonight have really reinforced that point. For me, certainly. As far as what we can do, Chief, to get to your question, well, I think I would also go back to what I said about making sure that we've properly financed things like probation, make sure that we've properly financed the programs that we have for these kids, because if we don't pay for it with evidence-based programs early on, we will pay for it later on down the line with incarceration and with victimization.
Okay.
May I add one thing?
Sure.
I think I'd like to see a consequences of crime class at some point in elementary school. Start teaching kids early on. Don't spend a lot of time on it, but start teaching kids early on the consequences of not just disobeying parents, disobeying teachers, but this is where, when you cross that line and commit a crime, this is what could and should happen to you. So I wouldn't mind seeing something like that added to our school curriculum. I don't know if it's possible. I'm not an educator, but I'd love to rely on the educators to help us with that concept.
Okay. Next question. How can we best ensure that the rights of our victims are respected under the law?
Have good law enforcement and prosecutors looking out for our victims' rights. Here's what you can't do. You cannot sacrifice the rights of the victim, the people whose homes have been invaded, the people who have had the guns stuck in their face, to try to salvage a kid who may not be salvageable. I think you've got to protect their rights first and foremost, and still look out for the rights of the perpetrators. But our victims should not be secondary to the perpetrators. They never should have been, but thank God we finally now are in the Constitution. Our victims are finally in the Constitution of the state of Florida, and we're seeing that their rights are being honored, as well as the defendant's obvious due process rights.
Mr. Reddy.
Well, I'll tell another story from the Texas adult system that I think is instructive here. I spoke to a legislator once from East Texas whose full-time job was as an attorney, and he knew a guy in his district who owned a convenience store. The convenience store had somebody walk in and write a $400 check. The check bounced. This person knew they didn't have the money in the account. They wrote the check anyway, and that's theft. At the end of the day, that is just theft. So this person was caught. This offender was caught. They were locked up for a little bit. They were dragged through the system. We paid for an attorney for them. They were obviously indigent. And this legislator that I know, he talked to this convenience store owner, and he said, "Aren't you happy this person really got what was coming to him?" And the convenience store owner said, "I really just wanted my $400 back, and I never got it." And I think that's a great story, because so often we really forget about what it is that the victim wants. I saw this poll that came out of Iowa. It was of burglary victims. And it asked these burglary victims what they most wanted out of the offender. And you look at options 1 through 6, I think it was things like community service, so give me my money or my property back, get them into some kind of treatment program. Lengthy stays and lockups were very, very far down the list. And yet I think a lot of times our elected officials forget that. I think that they think, well, this is what the people want to hear. They want us to be as punitive as possible. But that's not really true. What people are looking for, what victims are looking for, is for a punishment that fits the crime, not a punishment that is as punitive as possible. So what I would really like to see is maybe more input from victims. I'd like to see prosecutors evaluated more frequently on whether or not victim satisfaction and restitution is achieved. And I think that moving in that direction would be a great step forward.
Well, we're already in that direction, and that's one of the things when we met with Secretary Walters and her staff, we told them the reason you can't just hand out citations when there's a victim victim involved is you do have to consult with the victim and see, are you happy with restitution and, say, community service hours? Once the victim has put their stamp of approval on it, then the citation can be diverted. And that's our only issue with you can't just say, okay, we're not going to worry about restitution. Restitution is part of teaching a person accountability. So just give us those couple of extra days, and we call every victim of every case, or we should be. I'll be on my staff like you know what if they're not contacting our victims. It's a requirement. Victim contact is a requirement. We've had our victims meet with perpetrators before to try to resolve a case. In a reconciliation sort of fashion, especially when they live in the same neighborhood. It's one of the things we're working towards. But that's one of the reasons why we have to separate the crimes. And you can say, if it's a victimless crime, you can immediately divert that kid. But if there's a victim involved, you have to take the time to consult with them. And like you said, sir, a lot of them surprisingly say, just get me restitution, I'll take an apology letter, and then let's make sure this kid gets back on the right path. And that's a heartening thing to see, even for a mean old prosecutor like me.
Mr. Reddy?
Well, no, we agreed there. I think that's terrific. I'm really happy to hear that these kinds of things are being implemented in Duval County. That's terrific. We have a program in the city of Lubbock in Texas where we do victim offender mediation, and we have found such terrific results in terms of victim satisfaction. It really is quite surprising. I would have thought, to be perfectly frank with you, when I first began my research into this area, that victims would have wanted something much more harsh. I was completely wrong. That's not necessarily the case.
Okay, I'm going to go back and do that 180, back to our original question that we had up here. You're an elected official, so you get a lot of issues, meaning that people want you to do something about crime. Mr. Reddy is going to add on to you here. So they want you to lock the children up. They want to see the children locked up. But at the same time, we don't address the situation on how we're going to help these children come back into society. So as an elected official, you hear both sides of it. As part of government, what do we do to help these children? How do we start working on that?
Well, I think you help the children by obeying the laws, by toeing the line on the laws. And if they are eligible for diversion, you do it. But you need help from the public and, quite frankly, from the media. I have invited Jacksonville's local newspaper to come participate, come monitor our diversion programs. Let the public know that these are a good thing. They've never shown up. I invited them over 2 years ago, and they have never shown up to let the public know what our diversion programs are about. It would be a great thing for them to do, educate the public. When the controversial case went on this past summer that we don't have to name, it would have been a great time for our media to educate the public about the true aspects of justifiable use of deadly force and why stand your ground may or may not apply. But instead of doing that, it was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of emotion, a lot of racial overtones, and a lot of bashing of good people who didn't deserve to be bashed. So until we can get the message out to the public, and we go out and we speak to groups, we speak to Rotary, we speak to high schools, we try to educate them on the law. But the law is a complicated subject, and it's not easily portrayed to the masses through the media because the focus isn't where it should be. So I think anything we can do with our schools, our universities, and continuing to reach out to community groups, I think we need to do it. I think the town hall meetings that Secretary Walters has had in different places, I think those are effective, and we've just got to get the word out so people aren't afraid of the word diversion, but they're also not afraid of the word incarceration. We have to make sure they know things are going on at both ends.
Mr. Reddy?
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think you're right that it's so much about education. I think there are a lot of prosecutors who just sort of see their job as handling the cases. It's very notable that you're here tonight because you see your job as also involving an advocacy component. You have to get out there, talk, explain your position, educate, and that's really what it all comes down to. Now, I would probably want you to talk about slightly different things, but yeah, I think it's important that prosecutors get out and make, if I could ask them to make a certain argument, it would be to say, listen, we are doing the job that you sent us there to do. Unless legislators and voters get together and make sure they do the right things on the front end when it comes to funding the right kinds of diversion programs, it comes to funding the right preventive programs, then you are going to end up with a very dangerous situation with lots of very dangerous people who are constantly recidivating that we have to handle because that's the job you sent us there to do. So I would like for prosecutors to to make that argument. They have to be vocal. They have to get behind microphones like you're doing right now, and they have to make that case. I think that's probably the key.
And when we're drawing that line in the sand, so to speak, when do we educate and when do we incarcerate? When should we start doing those to these children out there?
Well, again, I'd like to see the education start earlier in elementary school because consequences have to be taught to children. The fact that they don't think they're accountable is the scariest concept ever. We've had teenagers arrested for homicide, and they're told by the detective, I'm booking you for this homicide. I'm booking you for this murder you committed, after the person's just confessed, and they go, okay, when can I go home? Now, you can attribute that to an undeveloped brain if you want, but I attribute it more to a lack of care or concern about what they've done or about themselves. So I don't know how we're going to make them care about themselves enough to want to do well. But I think that when you do put them into diversion, that someone has got to make sure that there's follow-up. Somebody's got to make sure that they don't fall off the path. But that is not the job of prosecutors or police officers. We have to rely on social workers, sometimes psychiatrists or psychologists, to say what kind of a program will keep them where they need to be. And then sometimes, no matter how subject to rehabilitation they are, you've got to incarcerate them because what they did is so bad and so dangerous, they don't really deserve that second chance. So,
Mr. Reddy?
Well, I do stand by the points I made about brain science, but I also think you're absolutely right that a lot of this stuff begins at home and it begins back in communities. And I'm very optimistic about a lot of the new research that's out there about what people can do to work with troubled families, to work with troubled communities, to get all these different components in a child's life involved whenever they've committed some kind of an offense. There's a program, for example, called multisystemic therapy, where you go and you get the kids' parents involved, you get the school involved, you get the local church involved, you get the friends involved, because all of these different components are probably involved, in addition to the brain science, in leading to the offense that occurred. And sometimes if you take the kid who committed the offense and you give them whatever sanction, whether it is diversion or even some kind of incarceration or locking them up for a bit, and then you send them back, you've really just kind of sent them back to the same troubled environment. And so these programs we have that are focused on that component of the problem, I think I'm very optimistic about, and I'm happy that places are moving in that direction. I hope Florida will be moving increasingly in that direction too.
but Chief, I will tell you, I think one of the lines in the sand we've drawn is with gun crimes, because gun crimes are so vicious and so violent and do take a lot of thought and a lot of dealing. It's a lot of physical action to get the gun, load the gun, use the gun in the crime, plan to take the gun with you to commit the crime, that I think those cases are different. And so we have drawn a line in the sand on gun cases. Do we still try to rehabilitate even some of the gun criminals, even the violent ones? Yes, but we don't do it automatically, and we don't do it without great thought for the consequences if they don't avail themselves of rehabilitation. Because the first thing you read in the paper is, well, the police locked him up. Why'd you let him out? But you can't worry about that. You have to take the right chance on the right person. I started my morning off this morning with a judge and a defense attorney and one of my prosecutors, hoping to help a criminal who has turned his life around and rendered substantial assistance. It's a fairly new law that our legislators have given us. It's one more way to try to recognize that people can be rehabilitated and do deserve a second chance in some circumstances. So see, prosecutors in Florida are very involved in the rehabilitation, but we're also the people that say, you've crossed the line, you're going to jail.
Well, I still think that you can't just look at the act. You have to look at the individual. In law school, really, from day one, everybody's supposed to take criminal law in their very first year. Every law school in the country, everybody does this. And on day one, the professor will ask you, okay, what's a crime? And the answer is that it has two components. It has a actus reus and it has a mens rea. You have to have a bad act, you have to have a bad state of mind. That mens rea, that state of mind, is so important. We all acknowledge this. We know that the offense is punished less severely, for example, if you've done it recklessly or negligently rather than if you've done it intentionally. We know that if somebody is mentally insane, their culpability is different than that of somebody who is sane. And we know that if somebody is a child, their culpability, regardless what the act is different from the culpability of somebody who is an adult. I think that mens rea issue is absolutely fundamental when it comes to this debate.
And earlier we were talking about tough on crime. Law enforcement and the prosecutors, we have all the power. A lot of people think the judges have the power, but it's really us, because we're the initial ones that make the arrest. You are the person that decide if you're going to try the case or not. So with that being said, a lot of people think sometimes we use our power too much to try to solve a problem. And Mr. Reddy, on that issue, do you think the government is involved in too much in trying to rear a child on this day and age?
Well, yeah, I think the government is excessively involved maybe in one area that we've discussed a little bit tonight, in schools. I just don't think that it's appropriate for low-level misbehavior to lead a child into the juvenile justice system. And that's an area where I just think that the government's role has expanded in a way that we never would have contemplated 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And I think that that's something that needs to be restricted a bit. That's not really the proper role for government.
Well, the reason you wouldn't have contemplated it those many years ago is there was a lot more discipline that they were able to render in the schools. I mean, a lot of kids didn't get in trouble because they didn't want to go see the dean of boys and get a paddling. And now we don't have that anymore. And whether you agree or don't agree with that, what we have is more kids disrespecting teachers. It's just a fact. There are more kids willing to cuss their teachers out, hit their teachers, not obey the rules of the class. So at what point do you turn so much focus on the disruptive child, because you don't want to put them in the criminal justice system, and the other 29 kids in the class are supposed to suffer because the teacher has to spend so much time saying, sit down, stop talking, stop writing, stop goofing off. I mean, at what point, it's almost like you're sacrificing all the kids who are good, who do obey their teachers, they do obey their parents, they do go to school, and they're entitled to a quality education without worrying that the same disruptive kid to get attention is going to come up and hit them or do something to totally distract the whole class. So at some point, to me, you get the offender out of the class and let the other 29 kids learn as they are entitled to do.
Okay, I'm going to come down to the last question here because we're getting short on time. If you could change one thing about the way we handle youth in the criminal justice system, what would it be, Ms. Corey?
I would allow for determinate sentencings in juvenile. We don't have that right now. We have programs, and the statute says a maximum risk program can last from 18 to 36 months. But really, at that point, unless they reoffend, a judge really can't hold them longer than that. And I would like to see some sort of a determinate sentence for juveniles, which would give prosecutors and judges a level of comfort that we just don't have right now.
Mr. Reddy?
I do disagree with that, definitely. I would not want to see that implemented in the juvenile justice system. But to get to your broader question of what it is I'd like to see, I almost don't want to mention any individual policy. There's so many little ticky-tacky things. What I think is more important is I want to see a broad cultural shift. I want to see more people talking about the long-term costs of these kinds of policies, again, in terms of both dollars and victimization. I want to see more elected officials discussing the fact that that we've maybe gotten trapped in kind of a counterproductive mentality over the last few years, because for understandable reasons, we did have a real spike in the crime rate for about 2 decades there, and something had to be done. But crime rates are dropping across the country. They're dropping in states like Texas that have decreased incarceration, and they're dropping in other states that have increased incarceration. So there are larger systemic things happening nationally, actually internationally. Crime rates are dropping in Japan and Western Europe and all kinds of places. There are things that are happening that have given us space to talk about alternatives, to talk more about diversion. I want all of us to acknowledge that more. We don't live in the Willie Horton days anymore. We have a space to talk about these things.
Any rebuttal?
No, I still say you're always going to have offenders that you have to be tough on. And I think that there is a difference in attitude. I don't think that you have a class of juveniles who are as respectful as we were when we were growing up. I really don't think that you do. You also don't have juveniles who are living in homes with, structure, and you have to be home and you have to get your homework done and you have to have dinner with the family. You have to have conversation at the dinner table. We've got kids who for days at a time, they don't know where their parents are. And the parents don't know where the kid is, and they think they're over at their aunt's house or staying with their cousin, but there's so much more of a loose family structure. How in the world are we going to get to the conversation you want when society has changed so much? I don't know how we can get to that kind of conversation, but I think there will always be a need to incarcerate violent and repeat offenders. And as long as we're not incarcerating the nonviolent offenders and the offenders who do want that chance at rehabilitation, we're willing to spend any amount of money it takes to give that person a second chance until they throw it back in our face and say, oh, by the way, I could have obeyed the judge's order and just stayed home and behaved myself, but I'd rather be out smoking crack cocaine on the corner with my friends. We're always going to have to punish the people who flaunt their noses at the criminal justice system.
Okay, we're going to end it right there. I want to thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming out tonight.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. This is
Thank
good
you. It was a
conversation.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, well, now we can talk. Now.
Oh,
No, you don't go anywhere.
Not yet, not yet.
Uh-oh, uh-oh.
Not
Now you
yet.
get the crowd.
Take a
Well,
break, though.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening. My name is Allison DeFore. For those of you who don't recognize me because of the long pants. I'm the chairman of the Project on Accountable Justice at Florida State University and a former prosecutor, public and private defender, a couple of kinds of judge and sheriff of my county. So justice world has kind of been my garden for a long time. And if you'd allow me a point of personal privilege, we've got two very distinguished guests with us who didn't get introduced because they weren't recognized by the people doing the introduction, but I think they're worthy of special introduction. Agnes Fury, are you here? And Andy Grossmare is here somewhere, and I don't know if Kate came in as well. They, if you want to see the cutting edge of justice, they both were involved in the deaths of their children by homicide, and in both cases were able to reach, through a long process of restorative justice, reconciliation with the murderers. And in the case of the Grossmares, a justice resolution that was agreed to by all parties involved. And I think if that's the cutting edge. And every time I think of something being too difficult for us to do in the justice system, I like to think of those folks. The Project on Accountable Justice at Florida State is a unusual partnership of Baylor University's Program for Pro-Social Behavior. What a radical idea to study things that work. And the Institute of Strategic Public Policy Solutions at St. Petersburg College and the Florida Public Safety Institute at Tallahassee Community College. We're governed by an executive board of which Fred Gaines, I believe, is here. Dr. Gaines, former president of Florida A&M University. Sandy D'Alembert was coming. I don't know. Under the Klieg lights, I can't tell if he made it or not, but we've got a very good board, and we are trying to advance the criminal justice system in the direction as best we can help to evidence-based practices and solutions. We think, broadly speaking, that the same trends that went through education and hospitals in the last 30 years are going to go through justice, an increasing look to measurable results. 30 years ago, if you'd have gone onto a high school campus or a hospital campus and asked the person in charge for their result data, they'd have asked you where your subpoena was, and if you hadn't had one, they'd have asked you to leave the property. And now they traffic in those things routinely, and I think we believe that's where justice is going to head. We also believe that the more we can talk amongst ourselves and maybe even break bread, the more likely we'll get to the solutions, and that's what this sort of thing is about, and we're a pleasure to have been part of it with James Madison tonight. We will now open the floor up for questions. Please keep in mind that your questions must stay focused on the particular issues we've been discussing tonight, which is juvenile justice. And there's plenty in the justice world we can talk about. We will not be talking about it tonight if it's not about juvenile justice. And we're going to take enough questions to fill the time that we have left, and we will end when we run out. If you have a question, please file to the aisle where two assistants are standing with mics, and stand as close as you can to the wall so that folks can use the aisle to get to the microphones. So questions, have at, and designate who you got them for.
Over there. Tori.
The microphones are at the wings, so if you have a question, head to the wings.
You already know me, I'm loud enough without a microphone.
And if you could tell us for whom you have the question.
Well, I
think it would be either one or both.
And feel free to say who you are, too.
Okay,
I know you, but
Dottie McPherson. Ms. Corey talked about the child whose eyes are dead, they're blank, and to me those are the children who have never known what love is, and they've been abused mentally, physically, emotionally, and to me those are the kids that are dead inside, and those are the kids that you're talking about, I think, and particularly the ones that commit the crimes and have no afterthought about it. Oh dear. So, and then you talked about the child who left the scene and left the weapon with the child who killed the pizza delivery lady.
Yes, ma'am.
And he still had to pay for the crime.
Yes, ma'am.
Why are we not holding their parents accountable? You talk about the role of government in juvenile justice. Well, it's because their parents are failing them in most cases. So it seems to me that something is being overlooked, and it's the parents who are creating these monsters through neglect, hate, abuse, whatever it is, and we're not really addressing the problem.
Angela, the question is to you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you very
Dottie,
much.
some of the parents may have neglected them. A lot of the parents are just hardworking parents who are out working at night and tell the kids to stay home, and they don't do it. And so I've been at the homicide office before where we've got a juvenile, in the interrogation room, and the parents come in and they're in their work clothes and they're distraught that their child has committed that kind of a crime. I've seen a lot of these parents put their finger in their child's face and say, "You tell these police officers the truth." And that's the most heartening thing to see, and it's the most heartbreaking thing to see, is that they have no idea why a child that they've loved has committed such a violent crime. And then we also have the ones, as you mentioned, who are neglected. But by the time they get to us committing that kind of a crime, it's too late to try to infuse them with the love and the warmth that they needed as small children. So we're hoping that whatever programs can help these kids early on, help them and keep them out of the criminal justice system, we will thank you for that. Put me out of work, I'll go run an antique store. I don't want to see these kids in our system, but unfortunately, they keep coming in.
And on the left.
My name is Victoria Joy, and this question is for Ms. Corey because I believe I heard Mr. Reddy say that he wanted to expand and allow other input for remedies. Ms. Corey, what I seem to be hearing from you is that government has an iron fist and is assuming all of the responsibility, whereas I was asked to write a proposal for the city of Chicago to help them change their youth patterns because Chicago was denied an Olympic bid because of the violent reputation they had. Why doesn't Florida let go and open this up to business people and educators to invite them to write proposals, to invite business people to give awards, and we give scholarships for education. Why don't we give rewards for kindness? Why don't we have children hold out their hand to honor instead of holding out their hand to give the middle digit? See, we need to have the whole community involved and have government let go of trying to do it all. Don't you agree?
I do agree with you wholeheartedly, and I'm blessed to be a lifelong communicant of the Episcopal Church, and
Amen.
our church is very involved in those types of, programs and those types of. I would rather see a reward system. We should reward kids for staying out of trouble. We should reward kids for pursuing college, not having, babies too early. We should reward the kids who are positive and who are moving in a positive direction. But that's going to have to be up to, like you said, private entities partnering with, like, the school system. So, yes, I think it's a great idea.
And on this side.
Thank you. I'd like to ask this question to both, if I can. This question was touched on by the moderator, but I want to ask it slightly differently. One study that looked at direct files nationwide found that 95% of children who were direct filed, over 95% were male, 63% African American, 16% Hispanic, And so the facts are clear that these policies that treat juveniles like miniature adults are having a disproportionate impact on particular communities, specifically communities of color, and even more specifically, black boys. And I wonder, are either of you concerned at all about this disproportionate impact?
It's not disproportionate to who's committing the crimes. That's the point. What is it disproportionate to? If you look at who is committing the crimes and who's being arrested for the crimes, then it falls right in line. There's a reason that we've incarcerated men more than women for all these years. Until recently, there's been a big trend. That was because men committed the crimes more so than women before. So it wasn't disproportionate based on gender. It's based on, you look at who was arrested for what type of crime and how are they treated once those arrests occurred.
Right.
And I don't see that disproportionate aspect that you're mentioning.
Vikrant?
Well, like I said in my original answer, I just think that so often these conversations can be a distraction. There is nobody out there, as far as I know, who is saying, well, the way we handle this problem with regard to inner-city black communities in our metro areas is different than the way we want to handle this problem with our rural white communities and the panhandle. Nobody thinks that way. So at the end of the day, the solutions are the same, and I really want to focus on those solutions.
Yes.
I want to stay with the direct file situation just a little bit, just to follow further on it. Because right now the situation in Florida is that, in theory, any prosecutor can take any case on a felony over to adult court for somebody at age 16. And for designated crimes, it can go down to age 14 at this point in time. Below that, you get into potentially having to seek judicial waiver for certain things and/or indictments.
Indictments, right.
With grand juries and the like. I guess my question to both of you is, if we're feeling so comfortable about the cases you're taking over to the adult system right now, what would be the problem with passing these through a judge and seeing if a judge agrees with them, or some other sort of safeguard in the system to see if these are cases that really need to be going over? Because we've seen in various cases here in this circuit, a number of cases have gone over that we've had some real questions over whether those really needed to go over.
And I would ask, are your questions based on a full reading of the file and the facts and the history, or is it based on the headlines that you see? Because a lot of the reaction we get is based on what the media puts out there. But when we do make the decision to direct file, and by the way, before we do that, or before, for example, we seek the death penalty, we invite mitigation from the defense and weigh that before we make the decision. And all the prosecutors I know are doing that. They're evaluating the mitigation before making the decision to direct file or, for example, to seek the death penalty. In the case where we put the 12-year-old into adult court, we worked with the public defender for 6 months before we made the filing decision. But you didn't hear a lot about that because nobody wanted to talk about the fact that we were working with the public defenders to see, what do you do with a 12-year-old who commits murder? We had numerous meetings to do that. So the judge can't engage in meetings like that. The judge has to sit up there and be fair and impartial and not do that. But a prosecutor can sit down and talk with the defendant's family. The prosecutor can sit down and pull the school records and look over all that and make that determination. And I think we've done a pretty good job of putting the right kids into adult court and still be able to have a judge look at those charges. And for example, if it's not a life offense, a judge can put them back. You don't put them back into the juvenile system. You impose juvenile sanctions from adult court. Again, I want to remind you, we're not saying, poof, you're an adult, so we're going to treat you just like an adult. We're saying we're going to avail ourselves of remedies that are involved in the adult system that we don't have in the juvenile system.
Well, I'll say that I don't see a problem with having a judicial safeguard. I think that, different people respond to different incentives. There's a certain incentive for prosecutors, and there's a certain incentive for the defense attorneys. At the end of the day, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a judicial safeguard because the judge doesn't respond to the kinds of incentives that either of those two sides respond to.
And over here.
I just wanted to ask a quick question for Ms. Corey.
Yes, sir.
You made mention previously about wanting to increase education for very young children to teach them more about the criminal justice system. We already have some education in our school systems in the form of school resource officers. We have police officers actually placed in our middle schools and high schools, and their job is basically to arrest kids. There have been a number of cases recently over the last year, 2 years, of kids being arrested and introduced to our criminal justice system for being disruptive in class. Disruptions being passing gas in class. I think it was an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. A girl who I think was 12 sprayed perfume on herself. They took these kids, they handcuffed them, they took them to jail. They introduced them to the criminal justice system in a way that taught them that it's no big deal. And you want to educate in a positive way. Why isn't eliminating this miseducation more of a priority?
Well, I have never seen our school resource officers take anybody into custody for passing gas in class. I don't know what crime that actually fits. Basically, our school resource officers, and I've seen them in action, they are very friendly
The species
with a
of
lot
assault,
of the
I
kids.
believe, would be technically speaking. but-
Assault with a, yeah. Basically, and I think it's great. The school resource officers that I've seen, because we go out to the schools and we talk to them and everything, they know the kids by name. They're there for them if the kids need them. I still have kids that still have contact with some of the school resource officers, and they're called resource officers for a reason. They're there if they need to be the heavy hand of the law, but they're also there to just keep the peace and facilitate orderly conduct in the schools. So those sound like a couple of circumstances that would need to be looked into. But what I'm talking about is actually teaching the entire class, not just, teaching them one at a time, but actually, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I don't know. I would like to see a consequences of crime class taught to an entire class full of kids so that they learn accountability. I'd also like to see financial responsibility taught in school. It's something I wish I had learned early on. I think it would be great to teach kids the value of money and how to manage money. So more life coping skills is what I'm saying. And of course, I'm assuming you're an educator, so you would know way more about it than I do.
Well, I'll happily pull up some of those articles. I very much appreciate your thoughts on them.
Okay,
Thank you. And I think the last question will go to Jim Clark. Unless he's leaving. In which case.
A long time ago, from the early 70s to about 1980, I was an officer in the state juvenile justice system. I was the bureau chief. And we had a Republican governor named Claude Kirk who had brought in a fellow named Ollie Keller from Illinois to reform the juvenile justice system. And he built a lot of community-based programs and that sort of thing. He was a good guy. He was a downstate liberal Republican from Illinois. And he brought in a lot of people from out of state. But when you look at the system today, and when I hear what our two speakers have said, little has changed. Many of the arguments being suggested by the two sides are pretty much the same as they were. What has changed is that in the United States, and in Florida particularly, we have more people incarcerated than any other country in the world, and it's very, very expensive. It costs about $40,000 a year to keep somebody incarcerated. It costs about $60,000 a year or a bed to build a prison. And we've got more people incarcerated than any other country. So the question is, are we spending our money wisely? California, many years ago, when they were looking at a prison overcrowding problem, the state legislature passed a law and said, we've looked down at each of these counties and we know which ones are incarcerating the most. It's probably Polk here, used to be when I was there. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, look, it costs us so much money, we'll give half of that money back to you, back to the state attorney. If they can, do something at a local level and cut back on the number of people they're sending into the adult system. So I guess my question is, if you had more money, if you got half back for every one you're sending into the correction system, if you said, okay, well, we're going to establish some programs locally, how would you do that, and what would you do with the money?
We are doing that.
Performance-based funding. What
Yes,
a radical
well, we're doing
idea.
that.
Jump in.
We now have drug court. We have veterans court, which is something we considered. Can we get our veterans early, and get the VA to help us with them. We have all sorts of programs where we're trying not to send people to the state prison system unless, again, they are the repeat offenders and the violent offenders. And I would invite any of you, if you can't come spend a day in court with us here in Jacksonville, call Willie Meggs and tell him you want to go watch his prosecutors in action in court. Go sit in court for a day and see how many people are actually being diverted into the kinds of programs you're talking about, where they're going to get drug treatment or PTSD treatment or whatever else it is that they need, because we do realize that that is going to be longer lasting and less expensive. But the people we're sending to prison are repeat and violent offenders, and there isn't a program where you can de-violence someone.
If I could press you on this point, because this will be the last question, then I want Vikrant to close on, because there's nationwide stuff in this. If you could be funded based on what you could do locally for diversion out of Tallahassee's pot, in effect, would that change your world?
No, because we already devote part of our budget to diversion. So we're already doing that, and we think we have enough money, and we're thankful for it. We still need raises, representatives. We still need raises, but because we're trying to keep quality lawyers in the system, because that's also an expensive thing, is to have lawyers cycling out and new lawyers stepping in to relearn the case and do that. But quite frankly, we're using every available rehabilitative type program that we can before we actually make the decision to send them to prison, if they are subject to that kind of rehabilitation.
And finally, Vikrant, there's this sort of thing going on around the country. Maybe you could share with us what's going on.
It is. Well, what the questioner is basically asking about, as you phrased it, Allison, it's performance incentive funding. And it is just really an outstanding idea. I think it hits upon a key insight, which we talked about just a few minutes ago, which is that people respond to particular incentives. So if you just lock folks up and then you tell the people who are in charge of monitoring the people who are locked up that, all right, we just put people in these cells and you do the job of watching over them, the incentive is, okay, well, let's get as many people in here for me to watch over so that you need me and that you need more of me and that perhaps need to pay me more. If you alter the incentive so that what you're asking is, okay, we're putting these people in here, but what we now want to measure is the outcomes whenever they come out. And let's measure recidivism, obviously, but in the juvenile sphere, let's measure educational outcomes. Do they graduate from high school? Let's measure victims' restitution. Let's measure these things, and then let's reward the counties with the savings that we have based on the efficiencies that have been realized. I really think it's a terrific idea. It is happening in places in Florida. We started doing this in our juvenile system in Texas in 2009. It's happening in several states all over the country, and I think it's one of the best innovations in the criminal justice sphere, really, in the last decade.
I think that completely disrespects the victim's perspective. Locking violent criminals, rapists, robbers, murderers, locking them up keeps the victim safe and keeps the community safe. And so you can't just say that there's an incentive to lock them up. There is a need to lock these violent criminals up. It's not an incentive. I don't get paid more. I've had the same salary for 5 years now as the elected official. There's the need to lock them up to keep one more woman from being raped, to keep one more man from being killed on a street corner, to keep one more family from being decimated by somebody who won't stop drinking and punching his wife and kids. So there is a need to lock those people up. Those aren't the people subject to the rehabilitative programs that you're talking about.
Thank you, Vikrant and Angela, both. We really are very grateful for your time and commitment to being here. You both have come a great distance, and we are in your debt.
Thank you.
If we could make them thank them ourselves. Thank all of y'all for caring enough to come out. Stay tuned. This will be an ongoing partnership.